Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest joint academic webinar between St Mary's University, Twickenham and the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name is Syed Kamall. I'm a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. I'm also the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. At St Mary's, we're proud that it is the #1 in London for course and teaching satisfaction in the Guardian University Guide 2020. If you're interested in finding out more or studying here, please visit our website, www.stmarys.ac.uk, and the St is ST there. The IEA is an educational charity founded in 1955 to improve the understanding of the fundamental institutions of a free society. And we do this by analysing and explaining the role of markets in solving economic and social problems. Now, for today's webinar, we're delighted to be joined by Baroness Stuart, Gisela Stuart of Edgbaston, to discuss as we seek to emerge from the COVID-19 lockdown-induced recessions, what can we learn in 2020 from the experience of Ludwig Erhard, who is widely considered to be one of the key people responsible for the German economic recovery, post-war recovery in the 1950s. But before I introduce our speaker, can I just talk you through the proceedings? We'll start with some opening remarks from Gisela as she speaks for up to about 20 minutes. Please feel free to submit questions during her talk. Don't feel that you have to wait until the Q&A session. Please don't be shy, but if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can select this option in Q&A. Please use the chat function only to share relevant links, or if you want to report a technical problem so we can check whether it's your end or at our end. After Gisela has finished speaking, I will move to the Q&A. And what I'll do is I will ask the question on your behalf. Now, if we've got lots of questions, can I ask for your help? Could you go to the Q&A function and vote for the questions that you think deserve to be asked? And in a very democratic way that we will we'll choose the questions at the top of the league, as it were, to put to Gisela. What I should also let you know is that we are recording this webinar, which will be posted on the IEA London YouTube channel, on the IEA website, and also the St Mary's University website. So please be aware of that. We are, I think, legally bound to tell you that. So now to our speaker. Gisela Stuart was a Labour MP for Birmingham Edgbaston from 1997 to 2017 and was Health Minister in the first Blair government. Has served on the Foreign Affairs and Defence Select Committee, as well as the Intelligence and Security Committee, which oversees the work of MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. In the 2016 referendum, she chaired the Vote Leave campaign, and since leaving Parliament, she's been chairing Wilton Park, which is an executive agency of the Foreign Office, and this year was appointed to the lead non-executive director on the Cabinet Office Departmental Board. More relevant to us at the St Mary's, we're delighted that she's a visiting professor at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and we will be calling her far more, so that's an advance warning. Gisela, thank you very much for joining us today in your busy schedule. I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also for the challenge to talk about Ludwig Erhard. Because in my 20-odd years in politics, this is about the third phase on where I've been invited to ask about him. And it started in about 2004 during the crisis when the Germans started saying, well, what the Germans need is a Margaret Thatcher. And I would write articles saying, no, you don't need a Margaret Thatcher. You just need to remember Ludwig Erhard. Just go back to what he did then. And then later on, as we had that handover from Tony Blair to Gordon Brown, where you suddenly had someone who was an exceptionally successful chancellor or finance minister, what Erhard was, who then somehow didn't quite cut it as prime minister. People are saying, oh, this is just like Erhard and Adenauer, the Blair Brown. And then, of course, now we come back to Erhard. And what I've discovered over the years is that the Germans have largely forgotten Erhard in many ways. I think it is revealing that there's only one recent biography of him, and I recommend you read it. It's very readable, by Alfred Mieczewski. And the Erhard Institute is not functioning. And the British have started to discover Erhard, as they do in regular intervals, just as the British discover in every 10 years the German apprenticeship system, and without ever really understanding why it works, the sort of copy bits, and then it doesn't work, and then they wonder why it doesn't work, and then 10 years later they're going to, oh, I know what we need to German apprenticeship systems. So I just thought it really is worth going back to trying to understand what Erhard was all about, and in the historic context of the Germany. And my favorite anecdote of Erhard is, we're talking 1948, Germany is divided into 4 zones, a British zone, a French, an American, and a Russian zone. And the question is about an introduction of a currency. And of course, rationing was at that stage supposed to be the most effective way and the fairest way of allocating resources. Erhard was economic advisor, and he comes to the conclusion that rationing was a bad thing, that really what you ought to do is lift all rationing restrictions. And with the introduction of the new currency, every German got 40 marks, the Kopfgeld, and they should be allowed to spend it. And Lucius Clay, the American commander, calls Erhard into the office and says, "Herr Erhard, I have to tell you, all my advisors tell me that you're about to make a really big mistake." And Erhard sort of shrugs his shoulders, smiles, and says, "Don't worry, General, so do mine." They go ahead, they lift price control, they lift price controls, essentially in rationing, in the American and the British zone. And literally overnight, goods start appearing on the shelves. 6 months later, the French zone comes around, that actually lifting rationing and removing price controls was the best way to let the markets operate. And of course, the Russian zone, it never happens because it becomes the German Democratic Republic and doesn't get reunited until the Berlin Wall falls in 1989 and German unification in 1990. But it was probably the only example I can think of where you had a real test laboratory of how policies can affect things. And so let's just look at Erhard as a man and what we can learn from what the Germans would call the whole Lebenseinstellung, his whole attitude to life. He was born in a very interesting place. If you take a look at Bavaria, the Free State thereof, 11 million population, commonly assumed beer drinking. But if you go to a northeast corner of it, it's Franconia. Not only do they not drink beer, they produce excellent wine. And there's a small town of Fürth, which has got a population of about 130,000. And that's where he was born. And Fürth had a strong Protestant community, but much more importantly, it also had a significant Jewish community. And if you just look at 4 of the key figures which emerged from this small place in the last 100 years, it's a guy called Schickenhofer who produced the catalog sales, Quelle, one of the big companies, Ullstein, the big publisher, but much more famously, Kissinger comes from that place, and Ludwig Erhard. So what you've got there is a community that does not accept the status quo readily. And Erhard as a man, if you want to think what drove him, was that he thought in essence people were decent. If you give people the right framework, they will do the right thing. And if you remember only one thing about Erhard and the social market economy, you remember that he said the markets are social. They don't have to be made social. So it's challenging monopolies. It's constantly allowing outsiders to come in. That is the merit of markets. And then, of course, you find that some people would say, oh, well, he was laissez-faire. No, he wasn't. He thought that you had to provide a proper framework within which those markets can operate. That's why he thought the competition rules. One of his greatest, the thing he was probably proudest of in post-war Germany, was the competition laws, which stopped the creation of monopolies, where you had natural monopolies, as he'd see it, like the postal services or energy. He'd say, well, all you have to, you don't nationalize them. He wasn't a great nationalizer. He thought you had to create the conditions for natural monopolies to operate as if competition played an element to that. He probably was the first one who thought there was a third way between the state control of communism and the laissez-faire approach of untrammeled capitalism. And in that sense, if you wanted to look at contemporary British politicians, he probably was a mixture between Ken Clarke and Tony Blair. Because the other thing which drove him was that, the question of cui bono, who benefits. And he thought an economy ought to be run in the interest of the consumer, because we are, at the end of the day, we are all consumers. He wasn't someone who thought that the state should proactively try and address inequalities, but he thought that economic growth would provide you with the framework to have a more equal society. I want to say one thing else to add to Adenauer, because I don't think you can understand that kind of post-World War II German development and their commitment to stability and framework without something else. And that Adenauer was Erhard's great foe, Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer was the first German chancellor whose political understanding was forged in the First World War when he was the mayor of Cologne. He saw German soldiers coming back from France. They destroyed Germany, and he was horrified of the inequality that would produce. So people like Erhard and Adenauer came up with something which they called Lastenausgleich, inequality, equalization of burden, because that West Germany was a population of 45 million, completely destroyed, about to host 15 million ethnic Germans who'd been expelled from the East. So if you look at the potential of the haves and have-nots and the tensions which that could produce, but Adenauer said, look, no, together with Erhard in many ways, they provided a 50-year framework of people taking interest-free loans, getting some compensation for properties lost, and achieved something quite extraordinary. So if you want to look at Erhard and what we can learn, I think we need to remember those conditions. And what I would say, the kind of the checklist we ought to look at is that we say, trust people. People are fundamentally decent. If you provide them with a framework, they need to know what the framework is. Adenauer was also someone who wasn't very quick off the mark in a sense, who said, if a crisis happens, pause and think and get it right the first time, rather than feeling you always have to react. And probably the way we have responded to COVID in many ways, and even still do, what people find most hard to come to terms with is the uncertainty of where they are. So the inequality which we are creating is one between people who are sufficiently well off, and have life conditions, whether it's a secure job or gardens, that, as the rules change, they can always adapt to it. But if you haven't got those choices, I think people want to have an element of certainty. The other thing which he said, he, for example, the economy should be there for the consumer, but he also didn't think that work in itself ought to be the sign of success. So that's why he wouldn't be like Tony Blair, because we, the first Blair government, we sort of thought we need to deal with social exclusion. So work should always be better than being off work. But Erhard kind of felt that there ought to be more to life than just work. So this wasn't this sort of relentless Protestant work ethics, that it was part of your community action, but creation of work or just working places shouldn't be driving the economy. So I think what we can learn from that is this debate at the moment. That we ought to have a long-term debate of what kind of society we are. Do we want to go on being a service industry? Are there some things which we think is manufacturing, which you provide the conditions? But just what we think our work-life balance should be. I think now's the time to really think about it. And rather than having relentless debates on the Today program, is the entertaining sector should we rescue the arts? Yes, I think we do, because there's such a huge social function. Do we need quite so many pubs? Well, maybe I'd be interested to have a debate about, could we do with fewer and some things? So don't just see it with the sector, see it with what they provide for society. Then, as I said, the markets are social. But then he also said, if you wanted the economy to recover, you had to try and provide some stability. And he would say the stability requires a number of components. Absolute believer in the principle of subsidiarity. And I really do hope that at long last, we do learn from the Germans on that one. Whether it is the Robert Koch Institute, it was more successful in track and trace in Germany over COVID, not because they necessarily had better medical provisions. They had access to proper local data and really local robust data where we can make the decisions. And Erhard was against big dominating bureaucracies. So, you could have a very mischievous little seminar on how would Erhard and Churchill have voted in the 2016 referendum. And I think there's lots of things that probably a heavy bureaucratic centralized EU was the last thing he had in mind. But he does that, respect local decision making, because that also to him was one of the building blocks for functioning democracy. So functioning markets, local buy-in to decision making and stability, he would have seen as the one thing which would guarantee democracy. And for that, he'd be a supporter of a strong state. So it doesn't that he want to have a minimalist state. He does want the state to be strong because he needs to guard some things, but only the things which are right for the state. That's why I think if we look at post-COVID now, and I finish with this sort of final observation, is I think we should pause, allow ourselves the luxury that for whatever we do next, the reason of because that's how we used to do it is no longer valid. Do have some faith in the decency of people. People, if you give them time, if you explain to them why you've made certain decisions, if you're seen not to make the decisions because they're in your interest of power, but actually in their interest, they do get it, and they will operate within that. Think by far more long term, which I don't think we have done for a considerable time. And remember, it's the role of the state to provide the framework for the markets who already are social to operate.
Well, Gisela, thank you very much for that introduction. That's already provoked a number of questions. I'm also going to do a few adverts here. There's a recent IA article by one of my colleagues, Professor Len Shackleton, on why we need a post-coronavirus Ludwig Erhard. I'm going to post that in the chat so attendees can see that. I will also later on post a link to a paper that my colleague, both at St Mary's and at IA wrote, Philip Booth, on Towards a Federal Britain, which argues exactly for this sort of decentralisation. I'll post that for the viewers. Anyone else who has a relevant link, please feel free to use the chat function to post this. This is supposed to be an interactive discussion. Can I just start off with a question, probably inspired by one of my colleagues here at the IA, Christian Niemitz, I recently recorded a webinar with him, or a recording when he talked about the German post-war miracle, but he didn't point to Erhard as such. He pointed to Walter Eucken, and his influence as part of that sort of Council of Economic Advisors towards Erhard. Could you say a bit? Do you know much about Eucken and his influence? Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually a good account of that in that biography, which I said, and it's kind of autonomics, which always sort of sounds like some practice you ought to disapprove of. But it was this providing of a framework, which was the important thing, and it arose out of the heavy dominance of the Prussian state, which was trying to control things to a kind of minimum. And these were genuine liberals in the sense, and thought you need to free things. And Erhard, I think, would admit to having been influenced by him. But in the German discourse, these figures have been largely forgotten. I think if you were to read about the German understanding of itself, there will probably go much more on the chancellors who followed Erhard and particularly Fischer in the 60s. And of course, they go on creating more and more structures and becoming more and more prescriptives. And this is what we tended to forget, that there were, these people were genuine liberals with a capital L.
Okay, so we've got about 7 questions. Please keep the questions coming. We've got plenty of time for these. And if you've asked more than one question, I will probably not ask all your questions in order. I'll give others a chance before asking your second question. So the first question is from Shanaka Katuawala, and who asks, would you include the minimum wage as an example of price control according to Erhard?
No, I don't think he would have seen. I mean, he was the guy who essentially subscribed that, if you just get more and more water in the pool, all the ships will rise. I think the minimum wage had to be seen in the UK context of, you have 1997, we came in there, 1 in 5 non-pension households. You didn't have anybody in work. So that made it actually very difficult to sort of say to children, you must go to school, you must be on time, you must be properly dressed, you must do your homework. When there come, in some cases, a third generation of parents and grandparents not having been in work. And the minimum wage was never seen as a wage tool. It was seen as a social tool for pegging benefits, because unless you had a minimum wage, you couldn't guarantee as a government that you could say to people, whatever you do, you will be better off in work than out of work. And that required the tax credits to come with that, because if you had people low earning, the tax credits then made that up. And the thinking behind that was that if you were in work, to get it in your wage packet actually respected your dignity. You weren't giving handouts, you were said, this was yours of right. And that's the bit which I think Erhard would have approved of, that if you gave assistance, it came through the wage packet. The mistake I think we made as a Labour government was that, and this is a mistake politicians continuously make, when you see difficult decisions coming down your way, we have a habit of kicking the can down the road by establishing independent bodies to make those uncomfortable decisions. And just as the Chancellor of the Exchequer gets up every year and says, this is how much we're going to spend on the NHS, and it's a political decision, I think we should have maintained the political annual accountability. The politicians say what the rate of the minimum wage is, and then we wouldn't have ended up with a position that it just slipped behind. I thought it was a great shame. So I think Erhard would have approved of a levelling up through the wage packet, but not a minimum. But just one more observation. It's quite interesting that the agricultural boards in the UK, they very much regretted the abolition of minimum wages, because they thought it was an industry-wide of doing the wages. And that's the kind of minimum wage Erhard would have disapproved of.
You spoke earlier about, and I want to tie a couple of things together here. You spoke earlier about the need to reconsider work-life balance, etc. Excuse me, and how we think about work. In fact, one of my colleagues here at the IA, Dr. Steve Davis, has been doing precisely that, thinking about the nature of work, particularly, for example, those people who may look after relatives and unpaid work and other issues like that. And of course, the debate inevitably has come up during the COVID crisis of the universal basic income and the various variations around that, whether it become a negative income tax as proposed by Milton Friedman or other forms of UBI. What's your thinking, and what do you think Erhard would have thought about the debate around UBI at the moment?
It's very tricky to say, because it's always, I'm always very cautious when you try and put mouth into people who are no longer with us. Sure. You see, for example, Erhard never thought there ought to be minimum prices for things. If you'd sometimes have these arguments of saying that there has to be a minimum price for X because that's what it costs to produce and it's not fair. And he would say, well, no, the price is fixed by how much I want to pay for it. If you're producing something, and so it was his consumer approach, that what I get from it, and he would have measured the success of a policy at the sort of the maximum of satisfaction with my purchase. I felt I've got something which was worthwhile. I think the universal wage in our context now, it's difficult to translate because you've got to remember, he would have operated at a time where, Kinderkirche, what was the third K? What did German women do? They had children, they went to church, Kinderkirche Küche. The work participation by women was fairly low. And of course, they already had a kind of social system. Yeah. The Bismarck system continued. And in the German psyche, because the one debt which even the post-World War II German government took on were pension entitlements. So they would have seen different social networks and safety nets. I think he would have taken a bit of persuading with an universal income.
So next question from actually someone we both know very well, Professor Philip Booth, who asks, how rapid was the transformation? I know that when I was very young, say early to mid-1970s, West Germany was looked at with envy for economic performance. In 1945, the economy was obviously in a catastrophic state. Roughly when did West Germany begin to look like a non-wartime economy and appear to overtake countries such as the UK?
So Philip has just reminded me of the third element, which played a huge part in German recovery, and that was the Marshall Plan. I mean, again, just to be realistic about politics, a huge danger of communism, and America realized that it needed Germany to be economically successful as a bulwark. And there's another story in there about how the Americans, the support for France, and you could say the roots of the Vietnam War were the Americans sort of supported. Anyway, I'm straying aside. Philip points at something which is the biggest gap really was when you looked at the German success from the British view. Given that food rationing in the UK went on, was it 54? I mean, the Queen's wedding, when Elizabeth got married, they still had clothes rationing. So whilst the Germans got a lot of support, for Britain, it was absolute the opposite. And I was born in 1955, and my brother was born in 1958. And it's almost for us, my sister was born in 51 and 55, for us, I can still remember some of the, no tarmac roads. I grew up in a house that didn't even have running water. I was still taught Gothic script. There was a kind of thing. And then you suddenly had the horses were sold and the first tractor arrives, the first television set arrives. For my brother, he kind of doesn't remember any of that. For him, it's almost that kind of real next jump. So I think by the early 60s, Germany really starts to feel we are going places. Whereas I think if you look at the UK in particular, that was still pretty much a black and white country. And of course, there's this, just sort of say my first encounter with IEA as an institution was when I arrived in England in 1973. So this was just January 74, end of the 3-day week. And I was selling academic books, and a German academic comes into the bookshop and he wanted the IEA's pamphlet on crisis, what crisis, because there was this sort of the Germans were up in arms saying, my God, what is going on in our country? And the British, by and large, were going, if we haven't got electricity today, we'll go to our mates and have the stoicism. So I think the two only got sort of in tandem, I think, towards the late 70s, where I would say both of them were. for different reasons at same level.
Okay, so next question. We've got so far 4 open questions, so please do feel free to submit questions. We'll probably have time to ask them. I've also got lots of questions, but don't let me hog the floor. So next question is from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, Erhard was inducted into the Montpellier Society in 1950. It was said they welcomed Erhard because this gave its members a welcome opportunity to have their ideas tested in real life. How important was this to the development of his ideas, to have them tested in real life?
Well, it's interesting because his biographer essentially arrives at the analysis that, and I think in that sense, he was very much like Gordon Brown, is that he formed his opinions and his view of life fairly early on. Unlike Gordon Brown, who does enjoy sort of really intellectual theorizing, I don't think Erhard particularly enjoyed didn't think of himself as a rigorous intellectual, but he didn't really change his views as time went on. And when he sort of made decisions which weren't particularly in line with his earlier view of life, he would have probably responded that it was political necessity which made him do as he did, rather than a big change of mind. And that's where I think he's a bit like Ken Clarke. I mean, I love Ken Clarke to pieces a bit. Indeed, we were both introduced to the House of Lords on the same day. But I don't think that Ken's changed his mind about much in the last 20 years.
No, exactly, no. He always finds it funny when someone thinks that he might change his view on Europe, for example. So it's good that you still get on with it despite that. Next question from Christian Niemitz. In fact, we've mentioned him earlier, author of the infamous book, Socialism. Do you think there is a way to make Erhardism, if you like, for want of a better phrase, appeal to the British left? In Germany, it is not just conservatives who see themselves as his ears. Social democrats have also tried to claim him as one of their own. And why not? As you said, he wasn't a believer in pure laissez-faire. Why is there no pro-market left in Britain anymore? Why is there no pro-market left, if you like, in Britain anymore?
That is a question which requires quite a big answer, and nice to hear from Christian. I seem to remember writing an introduction for one of his books on housing. So I think you have to understand where the left in Germany or on mainland Europe comes from, and where the left comes from in the United Kingdom. You see, I've gone into the House of Lords as a non-affiliate because I am politically homeless, and I'm politically homeless because I am at heart a continental social democrat and the closest to a major political party. So in the 80s, I would have joined David Owen. In the 90s, it was Tony Blair, and the minute the Labour Party wasn't Blair, Keir Starmer could probably take us back to there. But, I looked at Jeremy Corbyn and I was going, what do I do with this party? This is just, was totally alien. So the understanding of opposition in continent, or in Germany in particular, has always been much more pragmatic. So the left never had anything it could really fight against in a way it could do in the UK. So let's just go back to Bismarck. Bismarck didn't introduce a social security system because he was this great proponent of a welfare system. He looked at the world as it was. He realized that unless, if he wasn't careful, he would have very powerful trade unions developing. How do you avoid that? Well, you introduce a social welfare system. Similarly, the Rhineland model of governance, where the Social Democrats, if you go to Wolfsburg and VW, people like oh God, who was the German Chancellor, SDP in the 1990s? I'm having serious moments.
Schroeder.
Schroeder, Schroeder would have been on the Aufsichtsrat of Volkswagen, and it would have been seen the reasonable thing to do for producers, politicians, and the workers to be around the table and arrive at collective decisions. Whereas in the UK, the left saw it as being a challenging model. And the constant legacy and very damaging legacy for Labour and the left is that the left has never come to terms with the fact that if you ever want to be anything other than just a movement, if you want to be a political party, the whole point of being a political party rather than a movement is that you want to be in government and take power. So power is not something you talk about disdainfully. Power is the means by which you help those people who you think need representing and have been forgotten about. And I think that's the big difference. And I'm not even sure whether the German Social Democrats are that much in the eye. You see, because we've got the time, let me make a general observation about politicians when they suddenly rediscover figures of the past. I find it quite curious that whether it is in America, the two septuagenarians are fighting for the presidency, or whether I look here at, the media continuously having to roll up people like Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke. And I kind of look at and saying, where are the 40 to 50-year-olds who, sort of got to the top of the engagement, but also come up with real ideas? The 97 Labour cabinet, if you look at the Robin Cooks, the George Robertsons, the Alistair Darlings, the Gordon Browns, the Tony Blairs, where are they? Yeah. The equivalents. And so when you haven't got the new generation, you then try to come up with figures in the past who aren't so divisive or so well known that you immediately can get pinned down. And I think that's why they've kind of brought them back. And what I just hope is, if anything I can do to help a next generation to come up with, it's their models which we need to look at, so much the better. So please, as we used to when we got more women into Parliament, we had these posters, move over darling, with a little edge. If there are people out there who want to say to people like me, time for you to move on, love, I more than welcome it, but the ideas aren't there.
It's interesting, we see two things that stand out for me. One is, when I was the leader of my political group in the European Parliament, David Cameron invited me to address the cabinet, to tell them about the situation in Brussels and also what some of the things to be considered in negotiations. And I remember, looking forward to it, thinking, gosh, I'm going to be going to a cabinet meeting. I'm going to address this. It's an amazing thing. I was thinking back to some of the past cabinets, the Thatcher cabinets and Blair cabinets. And when I came out of that room afterwards, I thought there were probably only about 2 or 3 impressive people in the room. And that was what shocked me. Now, I wasn't sure whether I had a huge expectation, but you're absolutely right. Where are these great figures? They weren't there. And the second thing I think that struck me as well was when you were talking about Schroeder. Schroeder's very much forgotten in some ways, as sort of in terms of the people forget. Before Schroeder's Agenda 2000, Germany is going through a bit of a dip, and in some ways, Merkel benefited from some of the reforms that Schroeder introduced under Agenda 2000, and people forget that. Even like my German Social Democrat colleagues in the European Parliament, they were split on that. Some of them would say to me, it was Schroeder who was responsible for this, and others said, no, we want to forget Schroeder. So it's fascinating. I'm sorry, that was me. People want to hear from you. So let's move on. Sorry, I promised everyone I'll shut up. Next one's from Richard Tingle. How similar was Erhard's thinking to that of Ruka, or were there any significant differences between them?
I'd have to go back to the book. I mean, I remember Lübke, but I don't remember that bit. I could be busking it and pretend to know and probably have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. But no, I'd have to go back. I mean, I kind of just remember Lübke as when he then became president in that sense, but I'm not that aware.
You're not a real politician if you're not waffling. Come on. Right. Next one. Let's go. Philip Booth, I promise I will bring you back in. Another anonymous attendee. How pro-market? But actually, we asked about the left. How pro-market is the right nowadays? Hasn't a combination of the financial crash and COVID led to a reassertion of the importance, indeed necessity, of strong state intervention in the economy?
Yeah, if you were arriving on planet Earth in the famous spaceship and saw what the current government is doing and were asked which political spectrum is this government from, they would go and say it's kind of fairly leftish and interventionist. So, but you see, and this in part answers my own question about where are the big figures. You see, from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the realization that neither state, that state control doesn't work, we've kind of become complacent and become terribly managerial. And on the Labour side, I always used to joke, Manny Shinwell, who was sort of Peter Mandelson's grandfather, Manny used to say, socialist is what the Labour government does. And Peter Mandelson used to say, and the Labour government does what works. So both sides have actually become much less in terms of left or right as we recognize it. There are new dividing lines happening in society, but they don't tend to be about economic models. But the big challenge, which I think we have to come up with and is going to face us, and I'm so surprised that it hasn't got more traction yet, is not so much the state intervention. I think it's the intergenerational deal. If I look ahead and I look at the security, and if you go back, if Erhard says that people need to feel that decisions are fair, that that everyone they were made in their interest. If you want long-term stability, then I think it simply isn't sustainable that you have my generation taking a lot of the benefits with us, and then looking at our children's generation and say, but now you've got to pay for your pension, you've got to pay your mortgage, and by the way, you've got to worry about granny's care home, tuition fees, all those kind of things. Not to say in themselves that they were wrong. I think we have to at some stage say, how does all of this add up? And that's going to be really, really quite uncomfortable. And what will trigger this, by the way, the governments will face up to that. In 2017, when I was chairing Change Britain, we did 4,000 interviews, 2,000 before the election, 2,000 after the election. And it was quite clear, the election result, in a sense, I could work that out. But what I couldn't understand was the answers we got from the under 35s. It emerged that the under 35s wanted to nationalize the railways. They didn't believe in the contributory principle. And they loved the NHS. And I said, look, we need to do some more work on this, because what does this tell me? Because are there Corbyn's children? Are there Thatcher's children? And it emerged that actually they were neither. They didn't believe in the contributory principle because, quite frankly, they thought by the time they're retired, there won't be anything there. They wanted to nationalize the railways because they thought, well, you guys privatized them. They cost a lot of money and deliver rubbish service. They must be nationalized them. It can't be any worse than it is now. And they loved the NHS because they thought it was the one institution that was all embracing and fair, in as much that, if it was good or if it was bad, it was good or bad to you, not because of how much money you had, but because, it's the way it delivered. And underpinning all this was that the under 35s actually didn't think the state was any good. And if you have a position where the under 35s don't think the state is capable of delivering anything, if we have to fall back to Apple to provide us with the track and trace app, and if we have to sort of say, well, we tried to develop our own, and some of the glitches we've got at the moment have got to do with Apple's software, under 35s will start saying, why am I paying any taxes? And if you then have a position that government finds it increasingly difficult to actually find a basis for its tax take, I think at that stage, politicians will engage more with where the under 35s are coming from. If they don't want to pay taxes, and my view, and this takes us back to a very earlier discussion, and Philip Booth is quite right about the looking at the possibility of a federal United Kingdom, is that if my decisions about my tax spend are made within a framework where I can see where it's spent, and that's why I would be an advocate for local tax raising powers. That's why I want strong regional mayors. It's not just that this kind of devolution is good in itself. I also think if you want democratic buy-in and legitimacy, then you will do that. And as to the right, I think the right's a bit of a myth, quite frankly. Just as the left, we've kind of had a kind of manifestation of in Jeremy Corbyn of a kind of 1970s left that had sort of long gone. But figures of the right, I mean, where are they? I mean, help me. Tell me, who do you think is a kind of real right-wing figure at the moment?
Well, I think a lot of what we would call sort of classical liberals are keeping very quiet at the moment, and then others as such as, for example, have become parodies of themselves in some ways as well. But I mean, I'm just trying to think. I mean, on monetary policy, for example, it's very technical where they're quite good, but not in sort of the normal policy. So Steve Baker's great on sort of monetary policy, for example, and a lot of them have kind of drifted towards this consensus, particularly post-COVID or during the COVID crisis, in terms of, I think it's actually one of those times when normal ideological battles are suspended and people have put a lot of faith in the state. And also put a lot of faith in it. Bizarrely, compared to the referendum, put a lot of faith in experts. Remember that famous debate? And people are, on the whole, I mean, I think we've seen that break down a little bit now, but are trust in the experts. But now actually want stuff explained to them. Why is there a lockdown in the north? Why are you shutting pubs at 10 o'clock now? But anyway, this is not about me. Sorry. I mean, I'll try and get some more questions. There are 5 questions left. I promise you we'll try and get them on. We're not going to try and censor in any way, but you can help me at home or wherever you are by voting for them. So, and Philip, I will try and come back to your question, but I'm trying to be fair to everyone else. So Megan Emery asks, could you comment on how sustainable or viable the social market economy system is in holding up to today's challenges? Well,
a very simple answer. What do you think the alternative is? In a sense, most Western democracies are social market economies. In a sense, I mean, to me, the test is if China succeeds without having to become more democratic, then I believe then something I fundamentally believed in is not to be true. I think social market economies, together with the existence of democracy, goes absolutely hand in hand. And I mean, actually, there's one thing which is interesting. Erhard did have a view on international aid, in the sense that he kind of thought that provided people were trading with each other, you didn't need to exert power. But he did think that you should spend and invest in other countries to, as he would see it, help them emerge from the effects of empire. And again, you have to see him in the historic context, and help them to establish the framework within which they could be economically successful. So I would have said it's rather, do I think the social market economies are surviving? Yes, they do. But I think one thing which we could do is just be a bit more upfront about dealing with corruption in other countries. And I would get quite heavy-handed on that one. And of course, and if China succeeds, then I've been wrong all along.
And in fact, one of the challenges, I think, about that sort of assistance and conditionality in terms of corruption and conditionality in terms of the system is that China undermines all that. because they give the money anyway, because they're resource seeking, they want access to the resources they want, etc. And that's one of the challenges for those countries that set conditions for assistance. A couple of questions on the EU now. First one is anonymous. Do you think that the EU's competition policy could be possibly a consequence of Erhard's influence on German European politics? And how does Germany's new industrial policy, which many see as a rather French approach, fit into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, this has always been a massive big tension, but I think at the end of the day, the German view has always ended up prevailing. And I think a lot of the post economic miracle years, Germany first benefits enormously from having non-compliance costs. So when the UK joined, we had a sort of, whether it comes from industrial norms to any of the other things. And you see, the thing which is so different between the UK and Germany is that a German politician will talk about German interest, will not talk about German interests as German interests. It'll be just a kind of odd variation of the vocabulary, because for them, European interests and German interests are just so completely the same. And the French very often then try to react and respond to that. And there are more battles there, but usually Germany prevails. And the thing which is most remarkable, and I thought something would happen sooner, but it still hasn't, is that Germany's constitution constitutional court helps them. And whenever there have been battles between interpretation on some of the policies between the European Court of Justice and the German constitutional courts, the ECJ has always backed off. We'll have to see. And or post-2008 financial crisis, all those, I think they are big battles because they will have to do certain things to do with a fully integrated single currency and what that means in practice. So there may be some battles ahead. But yes, I think the EU policy was very much shaped by German thinking, very much so.
When you say about this,
the only other thing I would say what they've done is, however, and this is something which I don't think Erhard would have agreed, is that they have just created a much bigger framework within which it's very liberal, but they have created a fortress Europe, even though they don't want to face up to it.
Well, this brings us neatly on to our next question, and I'm not number of words and titles, so let me see if I get this correct. It's Professor Dr. Patricia Feldhoff, who asks, how do you square your claim that Erhard would have voted to leave the single market and customs union in 2016 because of the bureaucracy in the EU, with Erhard's belief that to achieve prosperity for all, you need a large all-European free trade area with free and tariff-free trade of goods and services, but also freedom for people to work freely across all European free trade zone. For Erhard, it was the formula 6 EEC countries plus 7 EFTA countries plus 5 other Western European countries equals 1. That's the question.
I think it comes out of, because, as I said before, sort of, I mean, I sort of said we can argue over this, but if you go back to the Erhard biography, there is a section there which kind of looks off, because you have to understand that his EU, wasn't even EU, his coal and steel community, which becomes a common market, not until 57. And he heaven knows what he would have made of what it is now. He was very much against overarching supranational bureaucracies. He wasn't even, on things like WTO and those kind of things. If you needed them, they had to be light touch. And it was in reference to that I made that point, is that I'm just not sure he would have been a great fan of heavy prescriptive bureaucracies. So he would have been, in my view, much more of an EFTA man than an EU man.
Yeah, and also maybe a line of Hayek's views on international organisations, much more in terms of spontaneously ordered rather than very much top-down bureaucracy, if you like. Because
and Erhard's comment about the markets, don't have to be made social; they are social. That came out of a conversation in an exchange of views with Hayek.
Yeah. So we'll see if we can squeeze in two questions. One of them is Philip Booth, so I'll leave to you to judge whether you've got to squeeze his second one in. But the first question is from an anonymous attendee. You're going to have to excuse my very bad German. What are the similarities and difference between Erhard's Soziale Marktwirtschaft, the German ordoliberalism, the laissez-faire approach of the Austrian school, and the economic approach of the new left in the 1990s? Can they even be compared?
I have absolutely no idea what the academically correct answer is. I actually was tempting to mention the Austrian school, which is one of the much neglected. But this is such an academic question that I think Philip Booth ought to be answering that one.
I won't ask to answer that quite yet. If you do that in the chat function, I'm sure he'll have a very short Adenauer answer. Philip, it's that final question. You mentioned, do we need so many pubs, etc.? Would Erhard have tried to plan sectorial development in that way, or would he have allowed the market to find where a nation's preferences and comparative advantage lie?
Well, let's put it that way. I don't think Erhard would have approved of the tied houses. I have absolutely no idea whether Erhard was a beer drinker or a wine drinker, but he certainly was a cigar smoker. Another hint of Ken Clark here. But if you were to talk about pubs, he would not have approved of the big brewery chains. He certainly would not have approved of the kind of conditions where tied houses, if you were successful, they yank up the rent in a big way. So whatever the number of the pubs would have been, I think he would have been definitely a man for the craft breweries and the small and independent ones rather than the big dominant ones.
And as we at the IEA would say, leave it to the market. Baroness Stuart, Gisela Stuart, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation. Can I also thank all of the viewers and listeners for joining us today? I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. I certainly want to read more and actually question Gisela far more on this. Don't forget, if you're interested in learning more about St Mary's University and our wide range of programmes in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education and theology at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, please visit the St Mary's website, www.stmarys.ac.uk. For more information on the Institute of Economic Affairs and for all our online productions, please look at iea.org.uk and check out our YouTube channel, IEA London, and hopefully you'll join us again for either a St Mary's or an IEA webinar in the future. In the meantime, please stay safe and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.